Dead Boys were part of the first wave of punk rock in the mid-70s, which also included groups like Ramones, Blondie, and Talking Heads. All four acts became popular through regular stints at the legendary venue CBGB, a club that catalyzed the independent music scene in New York City. But while their peers enjoyed success, Dead Boys would fall apart and were regarded as one of the most self-destructive and violent bands of the time. Despite their brief initial run, the group would leave a lasting impact on punk rock for years to come. Nearly 2 decades later, Dead Boys would be exposed to a younger generation thanks to one of the most popular bands in the world paying homage to their music. Today, let's talk about the history of Dead Boys. Although Dead Boys got their start in New York City, their roots were firmly planted in Cleveland, Ohio, beginning with the group Rocket from the Tombs. The first incarnation of the band would be formed in 1974 by future Peeraboo member David Thomas as an extension of a weekly tabloid called The Scene, which he'd write for under the name Crocus Behemoth. Rocket from the Tombs lineup would evolve over the course of several gigs, but eventually Thomas sought a more stable lineup, and first he'd recruit Peter Loeffner on guitar and vocals. In a profile on the band by Late Night Magazine, Thomas discussed getting to know the musician at a club, recalling, "I think I met Peter at the Grapes of Wrath, and he knew who I was because of my column in The Scene. We would run into each other and have some drinks and pass the time, and one day he asked if he could play in Rocket from the Tomb. Somewhat dumbfounded, I of course agreed." Second guitarist Cheetah Chrome and drummer Johnny Blitz followed soon after, and on the Blaring Out show, Chrome mentioned how they joined the band, saying, "When Peter Loeffner joined with Dave Thomas, they got a little more serious. That's when yet again another ad in the paper came. A 21-year-old looking for a drummer and guitar player who were into the Velvet Underground, Stooges, and things like that. So we called and we hit it off right away. We jammed the night or night after, and it just gelled." The classic lineup would be rounded out by bassist Craig Bell, and their persistence paid off. It was by February of the next year Loeffner convinced a local radio station to air their demo, and the band's demo would be recorded in their loft using minimal equipment, just one reel-to-reel tape recorder and a reverb unit. It also consisted entirely of original songs, which was unusual for the time, given that most bands in the Cleveland music scene were playing covers. Commentary by Loeffner would actually be included in the airing of that demo tape, in which he says, "The reason we did this tape and the reason WMMS is going to broadcast this stuff is to tell you that you can do it too. I mean, anybody can make a tape as long as they've got a little bit of stuff together, and it should be original." With increased momentum from their demo, their gig at the Berea Community Center would change everything when a Youngstown native named Stiv Bators joined them on stage to sing a few songs. While not as adept a singer as Thomas or Loeffner, Bators would make up for it with his larger-than-life persona. But rather than soldier on, the band would break up. Cheetah Chrome would recall to Late Night Magazine, "Pete used to talk about this little guy named Stiv Bators. We didn't meet until a gig in Berea where Stiv and Jimmy Zero were talking to Blitz and my girlfriends while we were on stage, which got us pretty pissed off. We were ready to start something with him, but Pete was like, 'No, that's the guy I've been telling you about,' and we ended up talking and going out for drinks the next night. Pete always said that once I met Stiv, he knew Rocket's days were numbered." It was according to Rolling Stone magazine, another reason the band broke up was because Chrome and Blitz thought the band was too arty and the pair wanted to play more aggressive music. Bators would tell Rolling Stone about the members' upbringing, stating, "You're all products of parochial schools. They turn you into a wimp totally dominated by your mother or your wife, or you become so hardcore that you survive like us." Once Rocket from the Tombs disbanded, their do-it-yourself ethos would inspire the members to start new projects and repurpose the band's material as their own. Cheetah Chrome, Stiv Bators, Johnny Blitz would recruit Jimmy Zero as their second guitarist and bassist Jeff Magnum to round out the lineup of their new project called Frankenstein. Fittingly enough, their first gig would happen on Halloween, but the band would break up after not being able to land gigs at the conservative-leaning clubs, and the members soon started fighting with each other. It was by the spring of 1976 that Stiv would make a fateful trip to a festival at Max's Kansas City in New York, where the underground music scene was flourishing. He'd also check out the club CBGB, where he'd connect with Joey Ramone and club owner Hilly Crystal. Bators had previously met the members of the Ramones during a gig that they had played in Youngstown, Ohio, Ohio, where he was originally from. When Ramones had played Ohio previously, Bators had played them tapes of his band Frankenstein, but the members of Ramones got a sense of just how crazy Bators was. Crome would recall in the book Please Kill Me how the members of Ramones weren't sure how to get to their next gig, so himself and Bators got in their car and showed them which exit ramp to take. Crome would recall how they were going 80 miles per hour and Stiv climbed onto the top of the roof of the car and mooned the members of the Ramones, and this was a pretty frequent occurrence he'd do almost nightly. When the Ramones got back to New York, Joey Ramone would put in a good word with Hilly Crystal so that the band could line up a gig at CBGB. For that to happen though, Joey had to stretch the truth out a bit. Crome would recall what exactly happened, saying Joey lied to Hilly and said, "I've seen these guys, they're great. He never saw us. He just watched a video with no sound." It was upon returning home to Cleveland that Stiv would convince his ex-bandmates to reunite and relocate to New York City, having made the necessary connections. Another reason Stiv wanted the guys to move to New York was because they would be considered normal there and not weirdos like they were in Ohio. The band would reunite, but without their bass player for the time being, and they didn't really have a new name. But Stiv would tell Cheetah Chrome a name he thought up spontaneously prior to rehearsal: Dead Boys. Crome would recall in his autobiography, A Dead Boy's Tale, "My first reaction was to think, what the hell is he talking about? Then I thought, that's the first line in Down in Flames. Then I got it, Dead Boys, for the name of the band. I shouted emphatically, we are now Dead Boys." It was the day of Dead Boys' first gig at CBGB, and Joey Ramone, who lived right across from the club, had made good on his word, bringing along several of his friends in the industry, including the founders of Punk Magazine, John Holstrom and Legs McNeil, with two other writers, Danny Fields and Lee Childers, following soon after. Crome recalled how Hilly Crystal warmed up to the band after their gig, stating in a separate interview, "First he seemed kind of, not grumpy, but not overly friendly. After we played, he really liked us and he came over and started talking to us. He was a big music fan. He really did love music, so that was a big icebreaker with him." CBGB had one entree on their menu known as Hilly's Chili, which included garnishes like cigarette ashes or the chef's own bodily fluids, or in the case of Dead Boys, their bodily fluids. Not to mention that the space had a rat infestation problem. As Dead Boys continued making their mark at CBGB, their live repertoire would be largely varied, featuring a mix of covers and Rocket from the Tomb songs. They'd also stand out amongst their peers for the onstage antics of Stiv Bators. In one instance, he'd crawl through Johnny Blitz's kick drum. In another, he'd even slash his own stomach with a mic stand, while another gig saw a woman performing a lewd act on him on stage while they performed the song Caught with Meat in Your Mouth. Bators' other antics, according to Rolling Stone, would include drooling bananas out of his mouth, dragging gum across the floor like a yo-yo, only to put it back in his mouth, smashing his head into the amps, fighting members of the audience, and so forth. The band's bio during their heyday even claimed that at one gig, Bators split his head open, diving headfirst into the audience, only to go to the hospital, get stitched up, and return to finish the show. He would obviously be influenced by the stage antics of Iggy Pop. In fact, if you've read a lot of interviews with Dead Boys in the late 70s, Bators would reveal in several interviews that he was the kid who gave Iggy Pop the peanut butter that he smeared on himself during his infamous 1970 Cincinnati gig. Alongside Stiv's stage presence, the band's shows would gain notoriety for their rowdy and violent crowds. When asked how much violence would occur at these shows, Johnny Blitz would tell the Suburban Rebels, "Tons. Fights in the audience were an everyday occurrence. I've had people throw their shoes at me and all kinds of weird stuff like that. I had one kid throw a sneaker at me, and to this day, I still don't know how the hell he went home with only one shoe on because it was snowing that day." The band were also known to have what Rolling Stone referred to as women-hating lyrics, with Zero telling the publication, "We do a lot of down-on-chick songs. Musicians don't need girlfriends, and they always have attracted a certain type of parasite. They want to hang around and use up your energy." Despite their lyrics, the band attracted a good deal of groupies, with the Miami Herald claiming that Sherry Magazine sent a reporter to do a story on the band, only for that very reporter to become one of the band's groupies. The Miami Herald would write how, in a stroke of bizarre, Sherry canceled the story and just ran the color glossies of her seduction. Even with CBGB's status as a proving ground, it wasn't always a full house, as some of their gigs were half empty, or in some instances there was nobody there. But the band also butted heads with other punk groups, with Bators claiming in a 1977 issue of Rolling Stone that other bands wanted to kill them. The reason? Well, the band's early on-stage attire in New York included swastikas and iron crosses. The band eventually scrapped those pieces, but when they first moved to New York City, they gave those items to Joey Ramone, who, unbeknownst to them, was Jewish. Within 6 months of performing, the band soon started packing the venue, and national notoriety followed. As Dead Boys developed a solid following, club owner Hilly Crystal would also become their manager, signing them after only their second gig. He would shop their demo around to labels all across New York City, and after receiving numerous rejections, they finally signed with Warner Brothers subsidiary Sire in March of 1977. Bassist Jeff Magnum would rejoin the band around this time, and Sire Records was a growing label, having signed the Ramones and Talking Heads. Magnum would recall in the book Please Kill Me, "They brought me out in Cleveland from Cleveland. First thing in New York, we dropped off my amp at CBGB's and I thought, I can't play music here, this is a dump. Then we went to the Dead Boys apartment on 9th Street. It was like I'm gonna die there. First night there was somebody screaming out the window, 'Get him, he's running on the roof.' All this madness, there's a bathtub in the kitchen and a melted copy of Wheels on Fire in the oven." Dead Boys soon headed to Electric Lady Studios to record their debut record Young, Loud, and Snotty, and the album would be produced by Jenya Ravon, who previously sang for the bands Goldie and the Gingerbreads. Ravon was told by Crystal to check out Dead Boys at CBGB's, telling her that their music was charming. She found their music and stage theatrics hysterical and agreed to produce their debut album, but admitted in the same book that she didn't want her name on the record. Ravon was Jewish and her parents were in concentration camps during World War II. She would scream at the band to remove the symbols, with her recalling how Johnny Blitz had no idea what they stood for, and she didn't really think that they believed in the ideology. Instead, she thought they were just punks trying to stir shit up. Ravon's raw style would define the songs that Dead Boys would be known for at their gigs, such as Down in Flames, I Need Lunch, and their signature track Sonic Reducer. Johnny Blitz, by his own admission, didn't know what to expect and was pleasantly surprised by Ravon's results, telling Louder Sound, "I couldn't believe we were letting a female produce our album. That comes with immaturity and age. I was pretty young at the time, but it wound up a great album. It still holds up today. I'll hold it up against anything." Chrome, meanwhile, would sum up what those sessions were like, telling the same publication, "Hell's Angels, speed, and being unable to go to sleep in the morning." Once the album was released in October of 77, it was a commercial failure, only reaching number 189 on the album charts. But it would go on to receive much critical acclaim. It would later be ranked as number 7 on Rolling Stone's list of 10 best punk albums. The band would open up some Midwest dates for Iggy Pop, and it was a dream come true for Bators, who would finally meet his idol. The first date would happen in Cleveland, and a dinner would be arranged at a local Chinese restaurant, but Bators had ingested some Quaaludes and passed out in his suit. In 1978, the band would be featured in the punk rock documentary DOA, which would document Sex Pistols' final tour, which saw them playing dates across America. They soon became friends with the members of Sex Pistols, with Blitz recalling a troubling conversation he had with bassist Sid Vicious, telling Louder Sound, "He was staying at the Chelsea Hotel the same time we were. I was into collecting knives, and so Sid started hanging out, and a couple days before he offed Nancy, he came down and we were talking. He asked me point blank, what would happen to me if I decided to kill somebody in this country? I said, they're going to throw you in jail, if not, give you the chair. And a few days later, he offed his old lady." It was during the press to promote the docufilm DOA, both Cheetah Chrome and Stiv Bators would appear on a talk show with writer, intellectualist, and California Senate candidate Gore Vidal. They would appear on a New York talk show called Midday Live, and the trio would have a discussion about punk rock, something Vidal admitted that he wasn't necessarily a fan of. The Toronto Star would report, and I quote, "Stiv offered Vidal what appeared to be cocaine, which Stiv said would help him in listening to punk rock, but Vidal politely refused. The whole interview had to be cut from the program when it aired the following day, but the producers for the TV show told the Toronto Star that the segment was cut due to what they referred to as technical issues, and that Bators did not have drugs during the interview, but rather he was simply joking." Just 1 year following the release of their debut album, it seemed like punk rock had run its course, at least in the mainstream. Given the Dead Boys' debut album flop, trouble soon arose. Midway through a national tour, Sire Records co-founder Seymour Stein called the band and their manager in for a meeting. As Cheetah Chrome recalled in Legs McNeil's book, Seymour said, "I bet a lot of money on punk rock. I was wrong. Now, if you want to continue your relationship with the label, we want you to change your image, change your style of music, and change your name." He wanted the band to be more pop and stop busting up places. Even bassist Jeff Magnum would recall in the same book how it was customary to bring beers to their meetings with their label, but even that seemed to be changing. Trouble with the label and band tension carried over into the group's sophomore effort, 1978's We've Come For Your Children. The band would be forced by their label to record the album in Florida since New York had too many distractions. In fact, at one point Lou Reed wanted to produce the record, but the band was pressured into choosing mountain bassist and producer Felix Pappalardi, and Pappalardi had already worked with Cream up until this point, and he heard the Dead Boys' first album at a party and thought the band was missing something, but still thought they had potential. He would end up phoning the band's record label and asked if he could produce their next album. Johnny Blitz described the unusual experience of working with a mountain bassist telling Louder Sound. Pappalardi walks into the room. He has this green suit on with gold embroidered marijuana leaves. I was like, holy shit, what have we gotten ourselves into? He'd also recall feeling unnerved during the first recording session in Miami, adding, his wife Gail starts talking to their dog Otis, this old English bulldog. So she's sitting there talking to this dog like he's a human being. And right now I knew something wasn't quite right. With Dead Boys and Pappalardi at odds creatively, the band felt that they'd work better with James Williamson of the Stooges, and they even attempted to have him take over as producer, but they were unsuccessful. Things got so bad that Crome would be intoxicated night after night in the studio and call Williamson in the early hours of the morning to beg him to come rescue the record. Williamson had no idea how Crome even got his number. Magnum would recall in McNeil's book, oh, the record was awful. Oh, no bass, and you couldn't hear the guitars. That's how he got back at Cheetah, referring to Pappalardi. He neutered him, just didn't put any electric guitar in there at all, and the recording didn't sound very loud at all. At the listening party, Magnum would recall screaming in Felix's face, adding, I can't believe you did this to us. It had no effect at all. We've Come For Your Children would be released in June of 78 to mixed reviews, and it didn't even chart, once again selling poorly. Pappalardi, for his part, would die in 1983, and his wife would stand trial for her husband's murder. I've actually done a whole video on this topic. It's quite fascinating and interesting. The link is down below. If there was any foreshadowing of what was to happen next, it would be stated by Cheetah Chrome's girlfriend, who revealed in the same book, the whole period from 1977 onwards was like a death period. You could feel it. There was a lot of violence. The glory days were over. The band's producer, for their part, would echo a similar sentiment, citing the band's attitude of always having a chip on their shoulder, of walking down New York City and getting into trouble, with her adding that it was one thing to walk with swagger around CBGB, but it was a whole other thing to do that around First Avenue, adding, because someone's gonna know you're not from this town and they're gonna fucking kill you. Things eventually caught up with the band when Johnny Blitz would be stabbed 5 times trying to protect the band's roadie in a fight. In response, Dead Boys held a series of benefit shows at CBGB called the Blitz Benefit to cover his medical bills, with Jerry Nolan of Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers filling in for him. There was also a smaller show held in Cleveland, and at one of these shows, SNL's John Belushi even played drums with the band. Blitz would eventually make a full recovery, but the downtime waiting for their bass player to recover resulted in Crome getting into heroin. Once Blitz recovered, Dead Boys would resume their tour, but after a month on the road, Sire Records pulled the plug and they were soon dropped. Dead Boys at one point were planning on axing Crome, and once him and his girlfriend got wind of the plan, their ingestion of illicit substances only increased, as did Bators, who started using coke and alcohol. It would result in him becoming far more volatile. Setting the frontman further off, it was rumored that his girlfriend at the time was having an affair with actor Jack Nicholson. In 1979, in order to complete their contract, Dead Boys would record one live album, but in an act of defiance, Bators intentionally sang away from the microphone and the recording was shelved. It would later be reworked with new vocals and released as Night of the Living Dead Boys on Bomp Records. While on tour though, Crome, Magnum, and Blitz all left the band one by one, but by the time the tour wrapped in 1980, Stiv was the only original member. The ex-members of Dead Boys would play in other outfits for the time being. In August of that year, Stiv would enlist new musicians for his solo album Disconnected, which took cues from 80s power pop. Although the album was warmly received upon its release that December, Stiv's band would break up by early 81 due to scheduling conflicts between them and his new side project, The Wanderers, which he'd formed while he was in England. Bators would start a new band called Lords of the New Church with Brian James of The Damned, a band the Dead Boys had actually previously toured the UK with. Stiv would end up relocating to Paris with his girlfriend Caroline, and Lords would sign with IRS Records, who was run by Miles Copeland, and the relationship was fraught from the start. Copeland was a strict businessman and didn't want to put up with the drug issues and the band's infight. Bators would land on one of the onstage monitors during a show, injuring his back. He soon discovered that the band was auditioning replacement singers when he saw an ad in Melody Maker. By 1987, Dead Boys would reunite with their original lineup for a series of shows, and Chrome would talk to the Washington Post that year saying, "It doesn't really surprise me that the kids are into it now. We've done a couple of all-ages shows and they've been packed. They know all the words, they know everything, and that's who we're always trying to reach anyways." But behind the scenes, the struggles remained prevalent. Chrome was battling drug addiction and recalled problems flaring up with the band, telling Louder Sound, "As soon as we were together for any length of time, they reared their ugly head. There was no management, we were it, and there was no band meetings except for van rides. Who wants to argue for 4 hours in a van? It was unpleasant and stressful." On June 3rd, 1990, Stiv Bators would suffer a traumatic brain injury and die after being hit by a taxi in Paris. He was just 40 years old. Fast forward to 1993, and Dead Boys music would get a profile boost when Guns N' Roses covered their song Ain't It Fun. Mike Monroe of Hanoi Rocks would appear on the track and was a close friend of Stiv's. He suggested to GNR that they do the song, and Rose, who already knew the song, agreed. It would be recorded as a tribute to Stiv, and it would also be included on the band's 2004 Greatest Hits album. Cheetah Chrome would be interviewed giving his thoughts on GNR's cover, to which he responded, "I think they did a great version. It struck me how close they kept it to the original. That's a tough song to sing. You need to have been through a bit to pull it off, and they pulled it off." Pearl Jam would perform Sonic Reducer, and Beastie Boys would sample the song. The band would pay tribute to Stiv with several one-off reunions in 2004 and 2005, but on April 25th, 2017, the group would play 6 shows in Canada to commemorate their 40th anniversary of their debut album, and this would lead to them reuniting full-time with vocalist Jake Hout. On September 8th, the band would release a re-recorded version of their debut album with their new vocalist called Still Snotty, Young, Loud, and Snotty at 40. Today, the band is still active and has toured as most recently as 2023. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.